Captain Thomas Whitaker came home from Europe on a gray Thursday afternoon with one duffel bag, a limp he refused to discuss, and a French wife no one in Ashford, Missouri, had been told to expect. The train arrived at 3:20. Thomas stepped down first. He was 38 years old, tall in the shoulders, leaner than when he had left, with a face that looked as if the war had taken its time carving into it. He wore his uniform because his civilian coat no longer fit right, and because part of him did not know what else a man was supposed to wear when returning from the other side of the world. Behind him came Elise. She was 27, dark-haired, slight, and carrying one brown suitcase with both hands. Her blue coat had been mended at the cuff. Her shoes were polished, but old. She paused on the platform and looked at the little town with the careful attention of someone measuring the distance between what she had survived and what she had just entered. Thomas did not introduce her loudly. That was not his way. He simply turned, took the suitcase from her hand, and said, "This is home." Elise looked at the depot, the feed store, the American flag moving above the post office, the quiet faces already watching from windows and doorways. Then she looked at him. "For you," she said softly. Thomas held her gaze. "For us, if you want it." No one in Ashford knew what to do with that. They had expected Captain Whitaker to return with medals, stories, perhaps a silence they could respect from a distance. They had not expected a wife from France. They had not expected a woman with an accent and a straight spine, standing beside him as if she had crossed an ocean by decision, not by accident. His 2 children were waiting at the house. Daniel was 12. He had grown nearly 3 inches since Thomas had last seen him, and had learned to keep his face empty in the way boys do when they are angry, but too proud to admit they are hurt. Margaret was 7. Everyone called her Maggie except her mother, who had died the winter after Thomas shipped out. Maggie had not spoken more than a few words at a time since the funeral. Thomas's sister, Helen, had kept the house during the war. She had done what she could, which was more than most would have done. But grief had a way of settling into corners. It got into curtains, cupboards, stairways. It made a house clean without making it warm. When Thomas opened the front door, Daniel stood in the hall with his hands at his sides. He looked at his father first, then at Elise, then back at his father. "You brought her here," Daniel said. Thomas set the suitcase down. "Yes." Daniel's jaw tightened. This was Mama's house. The word struck the room and stayed there. Elise did not flinch. She did not step behind Thomas. She looked at the boy with a kind of steadiness that made him angrier because it gave him nothing to push against. "Yes," she said. "I know." Daniel blinked once. He had expected her to defend herself. Maybe to apologize. Maybe to pretend she had some right he had already decided she did not have. Instead, she only stood there holding the truth with him. Maggie appeared at the top of the stairs in a faded blue dress, one hand on the banister. She looked down at Elise with wide, solemn eyes. Elise looked up. "Bonjour," she said gently. Maggie did not answer. Thomas watched the two of them, and something in his chest tightened in a place no battlefield had managed to reach. That first supper was quiet. Helen had left stew on the stove and a note saying she would come by in the morning. Daniel ate quickly and excused himself before anyone could stop him. Maggie sat beside her father and stared at Elise's hands, as if trying to determine what kind of woman had hands like that. They were small hands, but not soft. There were thin white scars across 2 knuckles, a burn mark near the thumb, nails trimmed short, hands that had carried water, bandages, bread, grief. Thomas noticed Maggie noticing. Elise noticed, too, but said nothing. After supper, Thomas went to the porch and stood in the cold. He had spent years wanting nothing more than to be back on that porch. Now that he was there, he felt like a stranger who knew where every board creaked. Elise came out a few minutes later and stood beside him. Not too close. "The boy hates me," she said. Thomas looked toward the dark road. "He hates that his mother died while I was gone." A long silence passed between them. "And you?" Elise asked. Thomas did not answer right away. Across the yard, the flag on the mailbox shifted in the wind. He had seen flags in ruined towns. Flags sewn from scraps. Flags hidden under floorboards. Flags people cried over when American trucks rolled through streets that had been held too long by men who believed cruelty was strength. Here, his own flag moved in the ordinary dark, above a mailbox that needed paint. "I hate that I came home too late to say goodbye," he said. Elise folded her hands in front of her. Then, quietly, "Then we will not ask the children to forgive too quickly." He looked at her. "We." She turned toward him. "I married you, Thomas." It was the simplest thing she could have said. It was also the first thing that made the house feel less impossible. The days found their shape slowly. Elise rose before the children and learned the stove by trial and correction. The first biscuits were too hard. The second were better. The third made Maggie look up from her plate and whisper, "Mama," made them softer. Daniel froze. Thomas set his coffee down. Elise only nodded. Then you must show me how she did it. Maggie looked startled. No one had asked her that before. They had protected her from memories, stepped around them, softened them, hidden them away like dishes too delicate to use. But Elise waited as if a 7-year-old girl might know something worth knowing. Maggie slid off her chair and went to the pantry. She came back with a small tin of lard and pointed. She used more. Elise accepted this with grave seriousness. Then tomorrow more. Daniel said nothing, but he stayed at the table longer than usual. By the second week, Elise had opened the windows in every room and washed the curtains. She did not remove Thomas's first wife from the house. She did something more difficult. She let Martha remain without letting grief rule. She found Martha's recipe cards in a box above the pantry and cleaned the flour from their edges. She placed them beside the stove. She took the children's old-school drawings from a drawer and pinned them in the kitchen. She mended Daniel's coat without mentioning the tear. She learned that Maggie slept better when the hall lamp was left burning. Thomas watched all of it in silence. A man could lead 30 soldiers through hedgerows under artillery fire and still not know how to thank a woman for putting warmth back into a room. So he fixed the loose handle on her suitcase. He sharpened the kitchen knives. He brought home coffee when the ration tin ran low, though he had to trade 2 Saturdays of repair work for it. Elise said nothing about the coffee. She made it the next morning and poured him the first cup. That was how they spoke at first. In useful things. The town took longer. At church, people looked at Elise with smiles that arrived too late and left too early. Mrs. Ada Pritchard, whose son had served in the Pacific and returned with a silver plate in his skull, asked Elise where in France she was from. Near Cannes, Elise said. Mrs. Pritchard's expression changed. My nephew landed there after D-Day. Elise lowered her eyes. Then he saw hard things. He did. My village was liberated by Americans, Elise said. I remember the first soldier who gave chocolate to my little brother. He was from Ohio. He cried when my mother kissed his hands. Mrs. Pritchard looked away first. After that, she brought Elise a jar of peach preserves and said it was too sweet, which meant it was her best. Not everyone softened. Walter Briggs did not. Walter had been Martha's older brother. He owned the hardware store, wore his grief like a badge, and believed Thomas had insulted his sister's memory by coming home married. He came to the house on a Saturday afternoon when Thomas was repairing the barn roof. Elise opened the door. Walter removed his hat with the stiff courtesy of a man who had already decided courtesy was more than she deserved. I came from Martha's sewing machine, he said. Elise looked at him. It belongs to the children. It belonged to my sister. And now it belongs to her daughter. Walter's mouth tightened. You have been here 3 weeks, Mrs. Whitaker. Best not to speak as if you understand this family. Elise stood very still. Behind her, Maggie sat on the stairs with her doll in her lap, listening. Elise knew she was listening. I understand a daughter should keep what belonged to her mother, Elise said. Walter leaned closer. And I understand a foreign woman should be careful how much she takes from the dead. The words were quiet. They were meant to be. Thomas came through the back door before Elise could answer. He had dust on his shirt and a hammer in his hand. He had heard enough. Walter turned. The 2 men looked at each other across the kitchen, and for a moment the room seemed to remember every funeral, every telegram, every empty chair the war had left behind. Thomas set the hammer on the table. Not hard. Carefully. Elise takes nothing from Martha, he said. She has been giving to this house since the day she entered it. Walter's face reddened. You don't get to replace my sister with some girl you found in a ruined country. Thomas's voice did not rise. I found her in a field hospital after 3 days without sleep, translating for American boys who were too wounded to know where they were. I watched her hold a dying private's hand because his mother was in Nebraska and could not be there. I watched her lie to children and tell them they were safe until we could make it true. Walter looked at Elise then. For the first time, perhaps, as a person. Thomas stepped closer. You will not come into my home and speak to my wife as if she is something the war left behind for me to pick up. The kitchen went silent. Maggie came down the stairs 1 step. Walter put his hat back on. This is not over, he said. Thomas nodded once. It is in this house. Walter left without the sewing machine. That evening, Maggie sat beside Elise while she worked the treadle. The old machine clicked and hummed beneath the lamplight. After a while, Maggie touched the edge of the fabric. Mama made my Christmas dress on this. Elise slowed the wheel. Then we will take care of it. Maggie leaned against her arm. Not fully. Just enough. Elise kept sewing, though her eyes had filled and the thread had gone blurry. The trouble came at the end of November. Thomas received a letter from the bank. The mortgage payment had been missed twice during the confusion of his return, and 1 note remained for medical bills after Martha's illness. If it was not settled by Christmas, the house could be placed under review. Thomas read the letter once. Then again. Daniel watched him from the doorway. We're losing it, aren't we? The boy said. Thomas folded the paper. No. But the word did not have the weight he wanted it to have. That night, after the children went upstairs, Elise sat at the kitchen table with every bill, receipt, ration book, and account paper she could find. Thomas stood by the stove, tired down to the bone. "You should sleep," he said. "You should have shown me these sooner. They were mine to handle." She looked up at him. "In France, when the Germans came, my father hid documents under the floor because paper could mean life or death. After liberation, the Americans asked who owned which house, which field, which cow. Paper mattered then, too." Thomas said nothing. Elise turned back to the accounts. "Sit," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. By midnight, she had found it. A county relief credit for families of servicemen, filed but never applied. A war bond Thomas had purchased before deployment and forgotten. An overcharge on the medical account, small but repeated. Not enough to make them rich. Enough to buy time. Thomas read her notes in the lamplight. "You did this in one night." "No," she said. "Your country did part of it. You served. There were promises made to men who served. I only found where they were written." He looked at her for a long moment. There were many things Thomas believed about America. Not the loud things men said on platforms. The quieter things. A promise ought to mean something. A uniform ought not leave a man's children roofless. A country worth fighting for had to be worth coming home to. He sat down across from his wife. For the first time since he had returned, he took off his captain's ring and set it on the table. Then he reached for her hand. Elise looked at their hands together. She did not pull away. That single gesture changed something in the house. Would the children feel it when they came downstairs? Would Daniel's anger finally ease? Would Maggie ever let herself lean on Elise? What kind of Christmas would this family have now? If this story touched you, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments which city in the USA you're listening from. Christmas came cold and clear. There was no money for much, but Elise made paper stars from old newspaper and tied them with thread. Daniel cut pine branches from the back fence line. Maggie placed Martha's recipe cards in a ribbon and set them near the stove, so Mama can be here too. No one corrected her. That evening, after supper, Thomas brought a small box from the mantel. Inside was his bronze star. Daniel had never seen it. Maggie touched the edge with one finger. "Did you win it?" she asked. Thomas looked at Elise before answering. "No," he said. "Men don't win these. They carry them for the ones who didn't come back." Daniel stared at the medal, then at his father. Something in the boy's face shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the first opening in a door that had been shut too long. "Were you scared?" Daniel asked. Thomas drew a slow breath. "Yes." Daniel looked down. "But you went anyway." Thomas nodded. "So did a lot of better men than me." Elise spoke then, softly. "That is why people remembered the Americans coming. Not because they were not afraid. Because they came." The room held that. The tree candles trembled in the window. Outside, the flag at the post office moved in the winter wind, unseen but still there. Maggie climbed into Thomas's lap first. She had not done that since he came home. He closed his arms around her carefully, as if she were something breakable and holy. Daniel stood for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat beside Elise. "I can show you how Mama did the apple pie," he said, not looking at her. Elise's voice stayed even. "I would like that very much." Walter Briggs stood across the lawn. After the service, he came over slowly. He looked at Thomas, then at Elise. "I was wrong," he said. It cost him something to say it. Elise gave him the dignity of not making it cost more. "We all lost people," she said. Walter nodded. His eyes moved to Maggie, then to the dress sewn on his sister's machine. "Martha would have liked the blue," he said. Maggie smiled. That was enough. Years later, people in Ashford would say Captain Whitaker brought home a war bride, and she saved his family. Thomas never liked that telling. It made Elise sound like a miracle, and she was not a miracle. She was a woman who rose early, kept accounts, earned the first biscuits, learned the second, and stayed through the hard silences until they became softer ones. Elise did not like the telling either. It made Thomas sound like a broken man she repaired, and he was not that. He was a man who had crossed an ocean when the world needed men to cross oceans, then came home and learned the quieter courage of remaining. What happened in that house was not rescue. It was rebuilding. A board replaced. A recipe remembered. A debt found and answered. A boy forgiven slowly. By spring, the Whitaker house no longer looked rescued. It looked lived in. Daniel helped Thomas repair the barn and began asking questions about tools, then about France, then about the men in his father's company. Maggie spoke more every week. She called Elise, Miss Elise, until April, when she fell asleep against her during a rainstorm and murmured "Mama" without waking. Elise heard it. Thomas heard it. Neither of them moved. Some words were too important to touch too quickly. In May, the town held a Memorial Day service on the courthouse lawn. Thomas wore his uniform. Elise stood beside him in a pale blue dress she had sewn on Martha's machine. Daniel held Maggie's hand. When the names of the dead were read, Thomas lowered his head. So did Elise. She had her own dead. A father, a brother, neighbors, children whose names were not written on any American stone. But when the flag was raised, she looked at it with tears in her eyes. Because she knew what it meant when it arrived in a place where darkness had believed it would rule forever. A little girl loved patiently. A flag raised every morning by a man who understood its cost, and lowered every evening by a woman who understood its mercy. And every Christmas after that, Elise placed paper stars in the window. Not because they were all she had. Because once, when the house was cold and uncertain, they had been enough. And sometimes enough, held faithfully, becomes everything.